Ulysses is usually happy to tell of his adventures as a time traveler. He has seen things that most men have not seen, and done what many saw as impossible. But there is one deed that he is not proud of. One he has only told a select few. One where he learned that sometimes the quick solution is not always the best. Ulysses had wound up in a strange land. Goldish sand stretched in one direction as far as the eye could see. In the other direction lay a vast river. Buildings made of sandy brick lay before him in what looked like a city. Throughout the city, dark-haired children played and ran about, as adults went about their daily activities of selling goods, fishing, and washing themselves in their clothes. Ulysses looked around in awe. Never had he seen such a place. The markets were full with enough lentils, fish, and fruit to feed the entire Union army. Jewelry of jade and gold, clean, freshly made linens, and all sorts of other wonders. The people wore little, no doubt to cope with the heat beating down on the time traveler. After several hours of exploring, Ulysses came across a huge monument. There was a doorway with 2 statues to the left and 2 more to the right. They were of sitting men with large headdresses and adorned beards. The statues were easily 10 times his height. Between the men were statues of women in long skirts. Above the door stood a smaller carving, this time of a man with a halo-like circle around his head. Covering the walls were simpler carvings of sideways-facing people in random shapes. Ulysses stared at the mammoth monument in front of him. He was so absorbed in its glory that for several moments he did not notice men running in and out with primitive tools. No further work was being done on the outside. Something must be happening on the inside. Taking care not to be seen, Ulysses ducked into the massive doorway. Inside, even more wonders awaited him. Towering above him were 8 more statues. They were adorned similarly to the ones outside. It suddenly occurred to Ulysses that the simple tools that were being used by the workers would mean that each statue took years to carve. Hours upon hours of total dedication would be needed to craft such amazing pieces of art. Ulysses could not wrap his head around it. After a few moments of being awestruck, he followed the workers. He saw them setting complex traps and puzzles. Whatever lay beyond these chambers was something they were desperately trying to protect. Ulysses hid in the final room and waited to see what it was. After a few hours, he got his answer. The workers brought in a ruby about the size of his fist in a dome. The ruby had a round cut and looked freshly polished. They placed it upon a shrine. Ulysses stared at the ruby, his mouth agape. It had to be worth at least several $1,000s, easily enough to pay back most, if not all, of his debt. Once the workers left the room, he grabbed the dome and made his way out of the place. This was not an easy task, as arrows kept flying out of the walls, nearly hitting him. Ulysses made a mental note to thank his army captain for teaching him how to dodge if he ever got back to his own time period. It was dark when Ulysses finally made it out. He was tired and hungry. Making his way back to the city, he found a melon that a vendor had thrown out after failing to sell it. As it wasn't quite gone bad yet, Ulysses broke it open on a rock and began to eat it. Once he finished the sweet, warm fruit, he found a stable on the outskirts of the city. It was warmer than outside, which was nice, as outside it had gotten shockingly cold. Ulysses' now well-worn army uniform provided little protection from such biting frost. Ulysses hid the ruby in the animal feed and found a clean corner at the stable. Thoroughly exhausted from how much he had walked and from everything he had seen, he was soon fast asleep. Ulysses was awoken by the feeling of something licking his nose. He opened his eyes and was startled to see his cat standing on his chest and looking playfully at him. Ulysses stroked the cat's fur a few times, then sat up stretching. The sun was not quite up yet, but the horses being awake told him that the sun would be out soon. Not wanting to be seen, Ulysses retrieved the ruby from its hiding place and left. He made his way back to the time machine he was helping to test and set the coordinates. He was soon back in at least somewhat familiar territory. It still wasn't home, but at least he knew more or less what to expect. Ulysses returned to the small room he had managed to secure himself to live in. He hid the ruby under the bed. While he was anxious to sell it and pay off his debt, the curiosity was eating away at him. Where and when had he just been? The monument he had gone to was built to last. Surely someone had seen it and known more about it. He headed back into the city and wandered, searching for a library. What he found was even better. A large building with pictures of the monument he had seen. It took Ulysses several minutes to recognize it. The bright paint had been stripped away by age, and one of the enormous statues out front was missing its head. Time had obviously not treated the place well. Ulysses turned his attention to the building itself. Above the massive doors it read, Lego City Museum. Ulysses made his way inside and was dismayed to find he had to pay quite a bit. It seemed one thing hadn't changed from his time. If you wanted to be smart, you had to be rich. Ulysses barely had enough to get him inside. Inside, there were all sorts of pieces of old-looking things. There were bits of pottery with strange writing and pictures, primitive tools and weapons, strange pieces of clothing and armor, statues made of everything from stone to gold, including an enormous dragon statue that was made from obsidian and gold. Wrapped up in all these wonders, Ulysses almost forgot what he was searching for until he found a small model of the monument he had seen. It was labeled Abu Simbel. One other man was looking at it as well. His clothes suggested that he worked at the museum. He had black hair, sideburns, and a curled mustache. The man looked at Ulysses with kind eyes and smiled to him. "Amazing, isn't it?" the man asked. He had an accent Ulysses had never heard before. It sounded somewhat British, yet not quite. Ulysses nodded. "You should see it up close." "I have," the man replied. Ulysses was about to comment that he doubted the man had seen it in the way he had, but then he noticed a change of demeanor in the man. His kind smile was gone, and his eyes seemed to long for something. "You don't look happy about it," Ulysses said. "It brings back bad memories," the man confessed, "but I'm not here to solve strangers." "Then let's stop being strangers. My name's Ulysses." Ulysses offered a handshake. The man smiled, accepting it. "Mine's Johnny." "So what happened to give you such bad memories of Abu Simbel?" Ulysses asked. Johnny took a deep breath. "Back in 2010, the Egyptologist Hiram Aziz contacted me and asked for my help. He had found a map showing Abu Simbel as the location of the heart of Osiris, a ruby that legend said could bring people back from the grave." Ulysses' eyes widened. That had to be the ruby he'd found. Imagine if it really could bring people back to life. It'd be worth millions, easily enough to repay all his debts. "Hey, myself, my family, and a few mates of mine made our way over to Abu Simbel. Of course, none of us realized that since Abu Simbel had been moved to prevent flooding, the heart of Osiris would have either been found already or would have been in the original location. Needless to say, we didn't find it. Obvious oversight made us look like fools. To make matters worse, my wife was killed. I'd hoped that the legend was true and that the heart would save her. But now I'll never know." Ulysses' heart sank. Of course no one had seen it when it was moved. It was in the possession of a man not yet there. And his actions, in part, had cost a woman's life. This wasn't like in the battle where he killed to stop the dividing of a nation and the freedom of hundreds. This was outright murder. All he could manage to say was, "I'm so sorry." Johnny shook his head. "I stopped adventuring after that. I couldn't risk the life of my other mates." Oh, my daughter. Ulysses closed his eyes for a moment. Getting out of debt wasn't worth this. He had to set things right. But first he needed the date that it happened on. But it would be awkward to outright ask Johnny. Ulysses instead asked, "What was your wife's name?" "Pipin Marie Thunder," Johnny replied. Ulysses nodded, committing the name's memory. "I'm sorry for your loss." Ulysses took another glance at the model description to learn where Abu Simbel was now located and left. He had a location. Now he needed a date. He made his way to the local cemetery. It was quiet there. Gravestones of all sizes and designs lay in neat rows. Some were crisp and sharp from being new. Others were barely legible. Ulysses quietly walked from row to row, gravestone to gravestone. He looked at every name, searching for the right one. Abigail Smith, Casey Smith, John Smith, Charlie Williams, Sarah Williams. Pipin Reed Thunder, he'd found it. Ulysses knelt by the grave. It was a simple square with a rounded top. Its true beauty lay in the red marble-like stone it was carved out of. Ulysses lowered his head, part out of respect for the deceased woman, and part an apology for his part in this. Then he silently read the gravestone itself. Pipin Reed Thunder, wife, mother, and weaver of words. April 18th, 1963, August 13th, 2010. August 13th, 2010. That was the day she died. Johnny would show up at Abu Simbel around that date. If he traveled to then and put the heart of Osiris back where he found it, Johnny would find it. Ulysses wasted no time. Not that time is hard to waste when you're a time traveler. He made his way back to his home and took the heart of Osiris out of its hiding place. He then made his way to the time machine, and after several attempts arrived in the chamber he'd found the ruby in, and on the date he'd attended. Ulysses set the ruby in its proper place on a rotating door. Then, just as he was about to leave, he heard a door on the other side of the wall open. Ulysses couldn't leave without being heard, and sent up a silent prayer of thanks for being on the other side of the rotating door where he wouldn't be seen. After the heart rotated to the other side, Ulysses watched through the cracks between the wall and the door. In walked 4 people. One of them Ulysses recognized as Johnny. The other 3 he didn't know, but he suspected the young woman was the daughter Johnny had mentioned at the museum. Or was it will mention? Ulysses hadn't figured out tenses when it came to time traveling yet. "Those 3 weeks certainly paid off," said the man who looked similar to Johnny. "I agree," said another voice. On a huge roadster, 4 unsavory people barged in. One of them, with a hook for a hand, grabbed the ruby instead. Ulysses stepped back horrified. What could he do? He couldn't let the hooked man take the ruby, but he also couldn't be seen. Suddenly, he felt the floor depressed behind him, and he heard the door on the other side close. Well, that solved that. He returned to watching through the crack, just in time to see Johnny's daughter throw a huge spider at one of the men, scaring him. While they were distracted, Johnny's team got into the roadster and crashed through the wall. The unsavory team followed in pursuit. The red-haired one tried to follow directly, but was killed in a trap. The rest came back the way they came, using dynamite. Ulysses escaped through the rotating door and hid behind one of the ruined walls. He couldn't draw himself away from what he was seeing. Johnny wrapped a whip around the ruby and yanked it out of the hooked man's grasp. The female ruffian then tried to trap them all by blowing up the entrance, but was tricked into blowing herself up by Johnny's daughter. Seeing they were outmatched, the remaining villains hid and escaped after Johnny had left. Once he was alone again, Ulysses made his way out of Abu Simbel. There was one thing he still needed to know before he returned to the future. Could the stone truly save Johnny's wife? He climbed atop of a stone structure and watched Johnny speak with another man. Nearby lay a dead woman, no doubt Johnny's wife. Blood soaked the front of her shirt. Her eyes were closed. her brown hair sprayed across the sand. An old man in spectacles was near her. He suggested they wipe Pippin's blood on the ruby. Johnny took some of Pippin's blood on a knife and wiped it on the heart of Osiris. A glowing red beam shot from the ruby to the dead woman. Ulysses watched in utter amazement as the beam worked, closing up Pippin's wound and dissipating her blood. Once it was over, the woman opened her eyes and sat up. Ulysses heaved a huge sigh of relief and made his way back to the time machine. He vowed to be more careful what he did in the past. He had no idea how it would affect the future. Some things were just best left to time. And with that, he made his way back.